How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. In season 1 of the Dwelling Place podcast, this longing took me on a 6-month journey around the UK to dwell with a variety of intentional Christian communities, sharing interviews with community members, leaders and founders along the way. In this second season of the Dwelling Place podcast, I invite you to join me in the US as I occasionally visit intentional Christian communities and share community-related interviews in the midst of my seminary education. In sharing these conversations, exploring the blessings, challenges, and wisdom of intentional Christian communal living, I hope to share glimpses of the transforming presence of the living God and inspire how it is we might be called to contribute to making God's kingdom manifest on earth, enabling people, God's beloved, to experience God's loving dwelling place.
I'm really excited about having a room full of curious people. I guess a little bit about myself. There's a little bio, but I'm from England, and I lived in I stumbled upon community by accident. It was a mixed ability community. I'll talk about it more later. But then after that, all of you was really convinced about community. I worked for a reconciliation nonprofit, and during that time, I absolutely loved the work that I was doing. It's an amazing organization, amazing colleagues. It's where I met Demarius as well. But I had this itch, but I need to learn more about intentional Christian community. And so I took time out of work, 6 months, and just went around different communities in the UK. So all of the communities I'll be talking about are in the UK. And it's not, I intentionally visited a diversity of communities, including communities which I knew I wouldn't necessarily want to become a member of. I wasn't visiting communities with the intention of finding the one for me. I was just visiting with curiosity about what are these different people doing? And this was just for personal interest, but whilst I knew I needed to keep myself accountable of capturing learnings. To keep myself accountable, I was okay, I'll do some blogging to make sure that I write down what I'm learning. And then I met actually one of your friends, Damaris, who was a podcaster. And I was maybe I should podcast. That means I have to write less because I just get to talk with people. And so as I went round, I intentionally interviewed people and wrote reflections in a blog form. And then it just kind of kept growing as a thing. Carolina's on the podcast, Sue's on the podcast when I visited Koinonia. And then I also realized in having visited all of these different communities, people would ask me, what are you learning? Or what is intentional Christian community? And I think Roberto touched on this in his presentation of when you say intentional Christian community, people are what is that? and people might jump to is that a cult? Or people can't quite conceive of what it is. And then there's such diversity in the different types of communities, the Bruderhof is so different to Koinonia. And so then I kind of organically came up with these 7 categories of communities that I'd seen as a way of describing to people there's these types of communities, and these are examples, and there are these types of communities. And so just a little note, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive, these are the 7 types of communities. That is not what this is. But this is, I visited these communities and these are the 7 ways that I've come to describe them. They are not discrete categories. I think each community actually has an element of each. But I think it's helpful because intentional Christian community is such broad language. I've just found it helpful to have these groupings in mind so that then you can start describing your community a bit better as well. Of we're mostly a community of hospitality, but we actually have a ministry towards young adults as well. So first type of community are what I call communities of hospitality. And so these are communities who essentially run retreat centers or centers of hospitality. A good analogy to think about is kind of camp community, this idea of people coming together as a group, working together to host people. They are usually very transient communities, and so and quite extroverted and busy communities, because you're constantly having a flux in and out of guests and are curating this experience for guests. And so the core community, often people just stay there with an expectation of staying there a year or 3 years. In terms of age demographic, they cluster towards young adults who are looking for something to do after graduating and are wanting this experience, and also the early retired. They're slightly harder spaces to have families, and they're usually open to families, but there's only ever like 1 or 2, and it's a very kind of chosen lifestyle. And interestingly, the ones in the UK have a very close relationship with the church. And so they are kind of founded in the institutional church, and people come to these communities as guests spiritually seeking. And so it's a slightly less kind of dogmatic space or creedal space than going to a Sunday church. But these are usually places which hold a lot of spiritual seeking. And at the same time, are also places where kind of clergy and ordained folk come for retreats. And so they hold this really precious space, this precious spiritual space which churches might find harder to hold. And they're also often in rural locations like camps. They are in beautiful places where people come and rest. So that's an overview. Now I'm going to go into examples of these in the UK. Who's heard of the Iona community? Yeah, so that's kind of like one of the better known intentional Christian communities. And so these are some pictures from my time. They're based on an island on the west coast of Scotland. You have to take 2 boats to get there. And they have a residential community living kind of in buildings around this abbey. So that's the abbey where the guests stay if you're a retreating guest. And then there are all these kind of little houses where the community stays. And they welcome floods of guests by the week. About 20 of them. Interestingly, they are a mix of staff and volunteers, and staff are contracted for 3 years. And there isn't an expectation that you stay longer than that. It is a really intense commitment, which you do for a time and then you leave. What is quite remarkable is, despite that transience, Iona has a really strong identity and have really strong worship resources, and they've been going on for a while. But members will talk about the fact that it's really exhausting because they're eating with guests like every day as well. And they have, I think, 1.5 days off a week. So it's like this really thrilling, intense experience, but it's not meant to be for life. But a very special space of retreat for many. This is Scargill, which is another community of hospitality in Yorkshire, so like middle, rural UK. They also come out of the Church of England, and similarly about 20 people running this site as a retreat centre. They have made the choice to only be, they're not staff, they're stipended. But they have no technical staff, and they all get paid the same in correspondence to the time that they plan to stay. So someone who's committed for 5 years will be paid slightly more than someone who's just staying for a year. And they made that choice after running into financial difficulty. So and once again, clusters around young adults who come for a year and early retired people. It's this gorgeous, gorgeous place. And then this one is Hillfield Friary. They're a bit different in that they are a traditional monastic community, Anglican Franciscans. And as a aging monastic community, they realized that they didn't have the manpower to maintain this site. And so they had the ingenuity to invite a lay community to live alongside them, so like non-monastic folk. And so now the monastic community and the lay community work together to run this site as a space of retreat. So I find that a really exciting model. And they're in the south of England. Any questions about?
What's that one called again?
This one is Hillfield Friary. And so the communities of hospitality are among the better known in the UK. Like if you mention them, people in the kind of know will know about them. Any questions around communities of hospitality? And is there anything like this in the US that anyone is aware of? Like, are there any communities which stand out as?
It's not like this, but this is kind of like that. But that they have more intentional community versus like a few employees kind of thing.
Yeah.
So just more live on people. Because there
Yeah.
seems like there's a couple of houses on the way in maybe where
Yeah.
people live. But
Yeah, here it's more, I was going to say we have retreat centers and camps in the States, and like this one, me and Tim both worked here for many years. The summer season is incredibly intensive communal living with all the staff living here for multiple months at a time. And then for the rest of the year, it's a very limited retreat season staff.
And do you pray together?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but people worship offsite on Sundays.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, most, it's like church retreat centers and church conference centers together with also some traditional monastics like Benedictine
Yeah.
Right.
will hold this space in this country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking Gethsemane is a
Gethsemane in Kentucky.
monastery close to us where
Yeah. Yeah.
the majority of people there are coming to seek something.
Yeah, exactly. And so these are, they're not monastic, but they're kind of filling that role of holding that space for people.
There's one in Washington State called Golden Village that's run by, I think, the Lutherans. And they are an intentional community, but they hold retreats and like programs, and then people come for like, say, an artist will come and then the people come to learn art for the weekend, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these communities also have like interesting programming, kind of spiritual retreat programming. And I think the camp context is really interesting because I have a friend who's on the board for a Quaker camp, and I think they've been thinking about whether they want an intentional Christian community looking after the camp, which seems to make sense. I can imagine an intentional community living on Camp Lucan and being responsible for the grounds, and also like training people in the skills of like groundskeeping. The other type of community, and I really like these, I call them communities of belonging, which is a very vague term, but a really important term. And these are communities which intentionally exist for people on the margins, and so they generally have quite a specific focus of holding people who just need a little extra holding. Unlike communities of hospitality where you have to very much be able-bodied and be able to deal with a lot of physical and just active intensity, whilst these communities create space for people to heal or to just experience empowering friendship. These communities I've experienced have a really powerful culture of celebration, and I think that's part of belonging is celebrating each other and really uplifting people. And because of the fact that they're holding people who need a bit more holding, the leadership which I've experienced in these communities have been very beautiful and incredibly profound. And because they are intentionally for people on the margins, that's often not along lines of faith. So it's holding, often the core community are Christian, but the people that they live with aren't necessarily Christian. So for some, you could say that dilutes the Christianity in a way, and that they aren't able to pray as a whole community in the same way, because not everyone there is Christian. But there is a very powerful Christian witness in the way that they are living. So that's a summary of that.
I talked to somebody yesterday who said that they operate like that, or non-Christians, but it's one of the rules to come in is you have to partake in that at least.
Yeah.
That's the only thing you do.
Yeah.
And then I'll name some examples and name how they get around that. I don't know whether any of you have heard of the book A Place of Refuge by Tobias Jones. So he set up this community and wrote a book about it. So if you're interested, it's a good little book. And this is a community, once again, in the south of England. And they operate as an extended household. So there is a warden family who live in this house. And then here on the lawn, which you can't see, there are these little cabins which they open for people who just need a place to heal. And so these are sometimes people recovering from addiction or who are kind of processing a divorce, midlife crisis, just need a change in life. And they just hold that space. And they eat together in the main house. They take turns to cook. They look after a small holding, so there are goats and chickens, and do a bit of farm work. But it's also very spacious in terms of the time to allow people to go to any medical appointments and just give them space to heal. And they get around the kind of mixed Christian, non-Christian by saying a word of gratitude before they eat. And there is an optional, I think, 10-minute silence before lunch. And there's also optional kind of Bible study. And the core community go to church on Sundays, which anyone is invited to go to. And if people come and they are Christian, there's scope for more like one-to-one Bible study or a more intimate kind of faith sharing, depending on what people need. So they're a very, very beautiful community. This is Pilsden, which the one that we've just looked at is inspired by, and also similar demographic of people who just need a place to be. Interestingly, they have a member who's been there for 40 years and also have people who just come for a few months. And so they've managed to hold long-term community alongside transients of people. Or once again, there's a farming component, looking after a small holding, cooking together, and they have this beautiful chapel. And this is my community. I'm there. I'm there. And this is a bit different in that the residential community is just 3 young adults, and we live in this little house which we call the Lodge. And we're inspired by L'Arche, if you know L'Arche, Jean Vanier and Henry Nouwen. And people with learning disability don't live in the house, but there is we host dinners and tea parties, and just have this beautiful kind of, you can kind of see the joy. Just a beautiful, joyful community of existing in friendship and friendship for friendship's sake, across lines of ability. This is also in Cambridge, so it's like a super intellectual place. And so part of the ethos of this community is bringing alongside Cambridge students, alongside adults with learning disabilities, and just be reminded that we are not defined by our intellect, and how to just lean into joy and friendship. So that's a slightly different model of belonging. When we live in the house as young adults, we all worked full-time jobs or were full-time students. So you're working in like mainstream world whilst being a part of this community, and just gathering on evenings and weekends. So it doesn't have to be a full-time commitment. But once again, an intentionality around a demographic on the margins.
And what's the name of your community?
Lynn's House. Thank you for asking. I forget. They're very, very, very dear to me. And here we are explicitly ecumenical. And so all of our dinners start with prayer. When we have our tea parties, there's a time for prayer. We're always learning how to pray better along lines of ability. So that's an example of it being, fully Christian.
There's a book on your community, right?
There is a book on this community called A Kind of Upside Downness. This is the community which set me off on my intentional Christian community kind of adventure. So that's community type 2. Any questions? And no, I'm trying to think of American. I was wondering whether koinonia kind of fits in this category, even though not intentionally holding people in a place of healing. There is a sense which it's a place you can go.
Jesus people started with homeless ministry, and they still do a lot of like homeless shelter type work.
Which might fit into a later category of community as well, which we're going to look at. So I think, and these are, other than Lynn's house, the other 2 are in rural settings, and so they are not in city context. They are separate, and it is about being slightly separate for that space of healing.
So it's more like, so for example, Jesus people or Even Jubilee, they have these ministry aspects for a certain type of group of people. How would you differentiate that from what you're calling community of belonging?
I think very similar.
They are similar.
Yeah. So I think Jubilee partners would be, and once again, these are not discrete categories, they're just to help us think about it, but I would think of Jubilee partner as an example of communities of belonging. And so creating a space of belonging for people who might find it hard to belong otherwise for whatever reason, whether that's learning disability, being recent refugees. And
So you said this is kind of like large communities, and so would that large?
yeah, I'd say L'Arche would fit in.
Yeah, within this.
Into this category, yeah. And the reason I didn't include L'Arche, well, I focused on smaller communities, and L'Arche is like a big movement and people know about them, so it feels less important to cover. And in the UK, they're still slightly torn about their Christian identity. They're still figuring that out, even though they're Christian in origin. They're figuring out how to what extent to lean into that now. But yeah, L'Arche kind of fits into this. Next type is communities of young adult formation. And so you can think of these as 1-year immersive discipleship programs. I think discipleship programs is a language more familiar to some denominations than others. But it's about young adults coming together for a year, starting at a specific time, ending at a specific time, and growing together in community. And these are often very life-transforming experiences for young adults who are interested in their faith and just wanting somewhere to explore that deeper with others. These are communities where an experience is created for young adults, so they are often staffed. So it's about a church or an organization intentionally wanting to create this space for young adults. And it's quite resource intensive because you're offering accommodation for young adults, maybe stipends. And so they are quite resource intensive and less naturally intergenerational. And so that is a component which has to be more intentionally built in to these communities if you want them, just as a challenge that these communities experience. This is the community of St. Anselm, which Demarius was a part of. Do you want to talk about Kosa?
Yes, so it's a year at a palace, as you can see. Lambeth Palace is in London, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the spiritual head of the Anglican Communion around the world, wanted to build a community of young adults to populate that place and live in that place, because Lambeth Palace in part is a very cold place, as you could probably imagine, in the heart of the British Empire. And so it's a year experience where people are spend a lot of time in robes and in prayer, and so generally prayer 3 times a day, exposed very intentionally to the monastic traditions of Benedictine monasticism, Franciscan monasticism, and the Ignatian spiritual tradition. And so there's usually like silent spiritual retreats throughout the year and various spiritual retreats. And it's also explicitly ecumenical. And so bringing people together from around the world in different Christian traditions and trying to figure out how to live together. And so that was a big part of this experience. And sometimes people stay for a year, sometimes possibly 2 years, possibly 3 years, but generally a year. Most of the time people will come for a year and then leave.
Yeah. Do you want to explain the habits? Do people?
The habits. Oh, the clothes. Okay. Yeah. So the habits, the white sort of robes, people would wear for prayer. So we had very particular spaces of prayer at the palace. So sometimes it was in a crypt underneath the palace, which was sort of a very lovely lunch. We got to be there, place of prayer, and so we would just always put the habits on to pray. And sometimes we put them on because the community also functions as the Archbishop of Canterbury, sort of like a prayer group or a missionary group for the Archbishop of Canterbury. So when you would visit different parts of England, people in the community will go with him to be a prayerful presence, or and also when he travels around the world, sometimes the community will travel with him to be this visual young adult prayer presence in the world. And so it's and now people, I mean, like myself and people who've gone through it will say, like, there is something about putting on a habit which is very helpful to get you mentally in a certain space. It's like, this is what we're doing right now, is we're praying. And a part of what was, I think, so powerful in that experience is being exposed to different types of prayer practices. Because there are many, as you all know, many different ways to pray. And most of us, if we're brought up in a certain tradition, only know like maybe 2 or 3. And once you're exposed to various things, like Eucharistic adoration, for instance, is that's a Catholic practice, which is sitting in the presence of the Eucharist because God is there present. Me and my Baptist growing up didn't do anything like that, and sometimes would sit there and be like, I wonder what my grandma would think about all this. And has become absolutely a transformative practice for me to sit in the presence of God in that way. And similar, there are a lot of other, there's a labyrinth in the back of in the palace gardens, and so people start to, this is a way to do this, and we would do things with art, or so that opening people up, I guess it was an experience of me and a lot of other people being drawn deep into a relationship with God, because the tagline of this year would be a year in God's time. So what does it mean to live in God's time? And so it's entering its 10th year of experiences now. It's probably been 140 people or so from around the world who've had this experience.
Yeah. And then
also, if I'm right, like a study component, and so people come in and give talks and you learn about like the Bible and theology and things like that.
Yes, and reconciliation, which is where I met, as an aside, this is not very important to you, but important to me, which is where I went Lakshmi's former boss at this Reconciliation Peace Building Center. And so they would have people come on Wednesdays and just tell us about what the work they were doing, how did you learn, and we'd have theologians that would come. And then we'd also do some sort of service. And so my service was as a hospital chaplain. Other people worked in sort of homeless outreach sort of organizations. And so that was an important component of it as well. So the teaching, the service, and the study were the sort of 3 ways we went about it. And of course, obviously prayer. And just trying to figure out who washes the dishes and how you do that, and who cooks the food, and how do you negotiate with this person who's from these different traditions, this person from Kenya and Poland, and they have different spice levels. Oh, the spice levels of the food. That was probably the most consistent battle. Our African friends and our Asian friends wanted spice, and the French people and the Brits were like, black pepper is enough. It was a lot. Yes.
Yeah. And this community created, formally employed an organization to do some statistical research on the community, which isn't public and which I wasn't supposed to read, but which I found under Morris's pile of things. And the statistics are really powerful in terms of people are saying that their experience of God is deeper, that they have a better sense of vocation, that they know about themselves better, know how to manage conflict with others better, all the things that we know the community kind of helps us with, but helping young adults do that in the space of a year in a very intense way. This program is very resource intensive. It's expensive to run. It is backed by the Archbishop and is financially backed. It's currently undergoing discernment about its next steps and how to continue funding it. So that's just a challenge which such kind of experiences face, but deeply, deeply formational. This is another young adult community of formation up in Scotland. It's called Craig Lodge. And they are very, very Catholic, charismatic Catholic. And so they've recently started a program of about 8 young adults at a time, and they get shaped, I think they call it a bit more of a discipleship program, and they get trained in more kind of the charismatic gifts of the Spirit. That's their particular kind of theological inclination. But once again, 1 year, you're there for a year in community and you get formed. And I met some people from that program, and once again, just deeply transformative. And I think these experiences really, really shape where people go in their kind of next steps as a young adult. So they're very powerful experiences. And then this is Lynn's house, which I talked about before. And this is just to say that I put this in the communities of belonging section, but also it's the residential community is 3 young adults. And so this is an example of how young adult formation can be incorporated into other community models. So I know that Koinonia, for example, you take volunteers or interns for a year, and there's like teaching alongside that. That's open to everyone, not just young adults, but to think about how communities can have these components added to them. And then I didn't have internet, so I couldn't add this slide, but if you've heard of things like Jesuit volunteer service, Quaker volunteer service, like that's the typical example of communities of young adult formation. I don't know whether there are any others which people can think of in the American context.
I know monasteries here that do year-long volunteer internships.
Yeah.
Episcopal Service Corps.
Episcopal Service Corps, sorry, I missed the...
For our disability.
I used to run one of those programs.
Damaris has been in 3 of those and run one of them. Do you want to say more about Episcopal Service Corps?
It's your service of people, and this is actually a slightly different point, but also these communities being alongside other communities is a part of what allows them to continue. So the community of St. Anselm is alongside the Sheminith community, which is a Catholic charismatic ecumenical order, which then does the formation work for the community. So usually they work well together. Episcopal Service Corps, like the one that I used to run, is alongside a parish community and embedded sort of in a church. And so then you have some of that intergenerational sort of stuff you're talking about. You have like a rector in a parish that comes alongside a community and allows it, because these communities sort of just independent out in the woods by themselves with young adults, and you got like problems. So, which, you know, I don't have to tell y'all, but you probably know that. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. You're good? Yeah, no.
And like the gift that is to young adults to be linked to an intergenerational body is huge, and not to be underestimated. Next type is communities of, and I put in brackets, young adult fellowship. Because the communities that I'm going to describe I've only seen in young adult context, but I don't see why they are restricted to young adults. So these are urban communities where people live in community together, but alongside full-time mainstream life. So people are either studying full-time or working full-time, but then they come back home and eat together, maybe pray together. Like a house share, but more than a house share. It's like an intentional Christian house share. And so they are self-organized, unlike the communities that we've just considered, which are really resource-intensive. These are really resource-light. And people just getting together, living together, and deciding that we're going to pray together, we're going to eat together, and support each other in our separate jobs and study. The difficulty in these communities is securing suitable property. I was actually thinking about this when people were talking about the decline in new monasticism and wondering how much of that is how difficult it is to actually secure property these days. So like if I wanted to get together with Caroline and be like, let's start a community, like we'd have a hard time buying somewhere or finding somewhere. And so this is where church or charitable help is really exciting. So if church has an extra vicarage or just has this random property and can give that up to a group of people who are wanting to live in this kind of way, that's like a huge, huge help. These communities are more self-contained. They're not necessarily naturally attached to a church. And so a bit more of a limited sense of community, but with scope for attachment. And as I said, I've only seen these in young adult contexts because that's when you don't really, well, at least in the UK, when you're out of school, you're not going to find somewhere to live for your own. You have to live in a house share, and which pushes people into house shares. But I don't see why people who aren't young adults couldn't live in this way of being, we are families, or we are early retired, or we're a mixed group of people, and we still want our jobs, but we would like to live together in a more supported way. So that's just a summary slide. So this is after having lived at Lynn's house for 2 years. I then moved on. It was quite an intense commitment, so people generally only stay for a year or two. Some people stay 3 years. But I was still living in Cambridge and still wanted to live in community. So I got together with Eli, that's Eli. And so together we started just an informal community, not designed to last exactly, but we were like, we want to live in community and there are loads of young adult Christians in Cambridge. Let's start something. So we managed to find a house, which is really difficult because people don't usually like to rent to an unknown group of 4 people who can't prove their income or who don't have a job yet. I had a job, but Eli didn't, and we didn't know who the other 2 people were going to be. It worked out, and it happened to be the cheapest place we could find in Cambridge as well, because Cambridge is extortionate. So by God's grace, it all came together. And then we started. Eli's great, and he was like, I want to cook curry for like the streets. So he just started cooking curry on Sundays, and the whole community came around him, and that became a weekly community project. And otherwise, we, as a community, we just decided to have an open house. So we often had friends round, people sleeping on the floor, like the house was often full, and just leaning into being, living together. Me and Eli only just knew each other. The other 2 we didn't know in advance. So slightly different from living with your friends. We still wanted to live with people that we didn't know. All lived our separate jobs. Prayer times were admittedly really difficult to schedule in because we all had our separate timetables. And so that's a difficulty of these kinds of communities, is it's actually quite hard to align your lives if you're all working separate hours. But a really great experience. It was just 4 people living in the house. These are just all the extra guests. And then another example, this is the 41 community in London. They're a bit more formal. They've been going for like maybe 8 years now. And they are very specific in that Monday is community day and it's community night. So if you work on night shifts or if you can't do Monday nights, you can't be part of the community. So that's how they get around managing London schedules. And everyone works their separate jobs, but they eat together on Mondays, and there's a cooking rota, so there's always a shared meal at the end of the day, which you can eat if you want to, but you don't have to. And just a wonderful bunch of people. Happens to just be young adults, but I don't see why it would have to be. Any questions about communities of fellowship?
No question, but one of my thoughts is, at least when some people talk about the new monasticism, at least in the beginning of that, the 2005 sort of place, I think that's where some of this like most easily maps onto, is some of that original Shane Claiborne and Jonathan Wilson Hargrove, these sort of starting off very slightly informal ways of people living together and starting with the basics, like, are we gonna like eat together, and like where we're gonna live together and how we do that, and then that growing into a rule of life, and particularly with the new monastics, that going very intentionally into what were monastics doing and how do we like, partially when some of the stuff got hard, because like what happens when like enough people go like, but I can't make Monday like a meal, and they start to break that, and then and that's who are in parts of those 12 marks of the new monasticism and some of that, because then it gets really hard. And so it's fascinating to see some of that, how it played itself out in the US context, and it's playing itself out as well in the UK context, and sort of, but doing so with some of the information of how it turned out in the US, which I think is probably some greater possibilities there.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that this community is stabilised by a couple, a married couple, and they're the anchor, and they've been there for however long it's been going. And then other people kind of come and go because it's young adults and it's London. And it's like we went. It was like 4-story house, and it's like 10 people. And the young couple have experience of, I don't know whether people have heard of L'Abri, which is another kind of international community, and so they were inspired, and so they have experience of community, and they are therefore able to hold this space for a wider demographic of people. Not explicitly Christian, they're wrestling with their identity, but people who come into the community write like a covenant, and so people come into the community writing about how they'd like to grow in their year of community, and that is read to the whole community so that the whole community can support them in what they're trying to grow through. So that's where there's a bit more intentionality. Okay, we're nearly there. Communities of neighbourhood, I don't know how to name these. I've called them neighbourhood fellowship, neighbourhood presence. These are maybe more like your Reba Place fellowships and like the Simple Way. It's either urban, kind of intentionally in poorer neighborhoods or diverse neighborhoods. The communities I'm talking about, they are generally integrated with full-time work or study, so people earn their living outside of the community. The community is spread across different houses, but in the same neighborhood, and often church associated, so a church linked to a church. And they are very much embedded in their locality, their neighborhood. Maybe more American language would be in a city. So this is the Acor community in Durham, which is my hometown. And so they come out of this is a church that we went to, kind of non-denominational evangelical church. And they have a few houses in this neighborhood, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, actually, I think. And they just kind of live there and have joined in other community projects. They didn't go in with like, we're going to start this project, but they just started like, we're going to live here, we're going to pray here, and then we're going to get involved how we feel is with stuff which is already going on. And they're mostly young adults, some with families, some singles. This is Hodge Hill, which is linked to a Church of England church. They had to demolish their church building, and then they made the decision with that money from the demolition and the selling of the land to buy 2 community houses. One house, when at the time of visiting, had 2 young adults. The other house had a retired vicar, but who suffered from chronic fatigue. And they use these houses as needs be, so they've hosted asylum seekers. People come and go, but anchored by some more stable members of the community. People work outside of the community, they're involved in church life. And so that's quite a simple example of just a church being able to use its extra property to house community. And once again, very much embedded in its locality. And this is Love Bristol. I really love Bristol. If you're ever in the UK, you should visit Love Bristol.
What word you're saying?
Love Bristol.
Okay.
And they are also non-denominational ecumenical church, and they also just decided to like be really present in this neighborhood. And they now have like 10 community houses of a mix of people of all ages. And they've started a whole load of cooperative businesses. So they have a furniture shop, a cafe, a charity shop, and then help people in the neighborhood find work in their kind of social enterprises. And just super present and a really powerful, prayerful presence as well, but rooted in these community houses. Any questions about these kinds of communities? I realize it's warm.
Sounds similar to the Springwater community in Portland.
Okay.
They minister to homeless people that live along the Springwater Trail. And, they have several houses in one block.
Yeah.
Any other kind of American communities? I think Simple Way I'd maybe put in this category. Reba Place Fellowship, I'd say as well. And then the last of the second to last. This is number 6. This is a bit different actually. These are non-residential communities and are essentially communities of prayer. And so if anyone's heard of Ian Mobsby, he's kind of big in this movement. And so this is about reanimating the prayer life of church congregations and enabling people to do more than just Sunday church, and providing people who are living busy family lives, busy work lives to come together and participate in rhythms of prayer outside of a Sunday service. And so this is Blackfriars in London, and so they just had a small kind of group of people praying together and once again exploring different types of prayer and different types of contemplative prayer. And this community drew a lot of spiritual seekers, so people who weren't necessarily Christian. Ian Mosby did a great job of some of these prayer times were about just holding silence and holding a space for people to explore alongside people who were very firmly Christian and wanted to deepen their prayer life, all whilst living their own kind of separate lives the rest of the week. And this is Trafalgar Square, so like the very centre of London, St. Martin in the Fields. So they're like a super well-staffed church, and they've started a praying community called the Nazareth Community. Richard Carter wrote a book called The City is My Monastery on this community. And once again, drawing people. This one draws like people who are homeless in London alongside people who are working in the city and financial district of London, but who come together in rhythms of prayer and eating together in Bible study.
What's the author of that book?
Richard Carter, I believe. And so he's come up with like a rule of life starting with 7 S's, and that's the rule of life which this community follows. And it's all about deepening people's spiritual lives in the hecticness, which is London. I don't know whether there are parallels here or if other people have questions.
I think Adam Bucko's work, and some people here probably read Adam Bucko, resonates a lot with this, and the Cathedral of the Incarnation, and I think it's called the Center for Spiritual Imagination. That's what it's called. Is that so? Yeah. Does a lot of this sort of work too.
There's a kind of recognition that like living in intentional residential community isn't for everyone, and people are really embedded with their families, but this is providing a way of deepening community in the midst of busy life.
What was the one we were just talking about? That
The
came on
Order of
the
Common Life.
Order of
Someone
Common
told me
Life.
about it today. I don't know anything about it, but
Yeah.
it sounds like that's what they said.
And then obviously I don't just, my focus is residential community, but you obviously have dispersed communities as well who meet on Zoom for prayer. So this is similar to this, but it's rooted in meeting at a specific place.
And there's a lay order of Franciscans in the United States. That sounds very similar to this.
And then the last of the categories I call communities of commitment. And so all the communities thus far discussed do not require lifelong vows, but communities of commitment I characterize by communities who take lifelong vows, like the Bruderhof, and they generally share all in common and kind of value stability and a real commitment, long-term commitment to the community, and more about witnessing to a certain way of life. Don't necessarily have a specific ministry per se, but about witnessing a life of poverty a lot of the time, sometimes celibacy. And so this is Madonna House. I don't know how many of you have heard of Madonna House. A few. They come out of Canada, but they have a little outhouse in the northeast of England. Really interestingly, a mix of, so it's a Catholic community, a mix of ordained priests and celibate singles. And so they live, they are mendicants, so they don't take any income. They live on donations alone and live a life of poverty and chastity, but without being traditionally monastic, as it were. And this was founded by Catherine Doherty, who was a contemporary of Dorothy Day. So there's similarities in kind of the Catholic worker and Madonna House. This is Darvel, a Bruderhof community in the southeast of England. I think we all know about the Bruderhof here, so no need to expand there. And then this is Chemin Neuf, which we briefly mentioned. How many of you have heard of Chemin Neuf?
Still can't pronounce it right, but
Yeah, I'm French speaking, my family's kind of French. But they are a Catholic, ecumenical, charismatic community. Yeah. So they draw on both charismatic spirituality and Ignatian spirituality, that's explicitly named. You can take lifelong vows. There's also ways to belong to it without taking a lifelong vow, but it comprises of people who have taken a vow of celibacy, but also married couples who have taken lifelong vows. They all dress in white and beige, so it's very subtle, but like really cool, and wear these crosses. So when you're at an event with them, you can still identify who they are. They are around the world, started off in France, Common Purse community, and they have a ton of ministries which they get involved with, including nurturing young adult communities. There's the Community of the Crossing in New York, which they now run. But also they run retreats, and they're really big in empowering their members to go where they're led, and just they're like, we are open to the Spirit, and we will work for the Spirit in our community life. And they have a house, an abbey in the south of England, Scalarda Abbey. Any questions on those kinds of communities?
I'll just say that the Shemanuf community are beneficiaries, strangely, of the sort of rolling failures of some traditional monastic communities, because now there's sort of an awareness of them and they're around the world. And so when a lot of these sort of legacy monastic communities, which will have like two, older women who are like, in their 80s or whatever, and they're like, oh, we have this huge abbey and we don't know what to do with it. These folks have become sort of known, particularly in their own Catholic world, and to some extent now because they're ecumenical in the Anglican world, of being like, oh, well, we'll like move in and we will like fix up your dilapidated monastery and start a ministry here. And so that's an important part of how they are sort of populating and growing, is that they find themselves near in this almost sort of interesting hospice style sort of ministry, and they know that about themselves, and so they are like the resurrection for a lot of people. And so some of these monks and nuns who are lamenting that, like, oh, our order is going to like go out of existence, do find hope. And these folks who will swoop in and be like, don't worry, we'll find like 7 young people from Mauritius and put them in your like monastery, and life will continue. And so they're doing this really beautiful thing in that way.
Yeah, they're really cool.
And they're heavy on the charismatic, like heavy.
Yeah. So we have come to the end of the 7 types, which are summarized here. As I said, not comprehensive, but can hopefully kind of be the beginning of a conversation of just to help situate the different types in our heads. And I hope also helpful in terms of thinking about what Damaris has pointed to, like, oh, we have an empty building. What do we do with it? Do we want it to be a place of hospitality and have a small group of people run that as a community? Do we actually want to focus on young adult formation and have a house for young adults in our church community so that when they have finished school, they have a place to stay connected and develop skills or be placed in kind of service opportunities in the neighborhood? Do we want to grow into this idea of a neighborhood fellowship and be more present to our community? Do we have a calling to help people pray even if they don't live with us? Do we have a way that we could incorporate our wider locality and just coming together to pray? Or are we a community of lifelong commitment? And if we are a community of lifelong commitment, are we able to participate? Are we being called to participate in any of these other ways of doing community? So that's this kind of 7 types. I was interested to know, given these 7 types, how would you describe the community that you are currently a part of or that you have previously been a part of? And so I'm interested whether these categories make sense to you, whether there's anything which you feel is missing, like whether the language is intuitive or not intuitive. And so I'd be really interested in hearing about that, and also clumping in the question of whether this is helpful to you in thinking about community.
One thought that I have as a category I often hear people talk about is like communities of mission, which I think is very similar but slightly different from the idea of community of belonging, because in these like missional groups, the people that are being served don't necessarily become part of the community in the same way. So we're uniting around the fact that we do like homeless outreach, but those people never become part of the community. Is a type of community I have seen.
Yeah.
And that's not exclusive. Sometimes the barriers can shift. If you meet a certain person throughout that ministry that then falls in love with the ministry and becomes a member, but it feels slightly different to me.
Yeah.
That's kind of what the Jesus Loves You project is. It's a community of people. We don't live together yet, and that's kind of why I'm here. We're exploring a way to do that, because we also, in our outreach, find a lot of people and would like to do some kind of belonging.
Yeah.
Oh, that's mixed with, it's like, this all makes me
Or,
think about what we're doing and how to like put words to it.
Or like the neighborhood fellowship, which I could also call, like, this is the neighborhood fellowship one is the one where like, I don't know what to name it. And maybe it is more communities of mission or like urban mission. And so then there's a sense of like you are living in an urban area where there are these problems like homelessness, but you are living in the area.
And it's multiple churches too
Can be.
that are becoming part of this community
right, yeah.
and joining the larger mission of the Jesus Loves You
Yeah.
Project. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. Yeah.
But it made me go, maybe I do have community already.
There are different types of community.
So, like,
Yeah.
narrowly focused
Yeah.
on maybe the lifelong commitment kind and the like big like agricultural community.
Maybe it's a bunch of like volunteers or I don't know whether you're staffed, but living together and just agreeing that you're going to eat together once a week and pray together.
Yeah,
And that'd be the beginning. Yeah, okay, well there you go.
But we call it home group, you know?
Yeah.
So
Any other comments on what you'd add, what's helpful, what's not helpful?
I think often the conversation is like, okay, like, do you live together and how do you live together? Do you live in a home? Do you live in a neighborhood? Are you sort of this dispersed online community? And then within that, there's some that work together and there's some that sort of work independently. And so I wonder if you were to flip the like, orders of the questions, are there communities of people that work together but don't necessarily have like an intentional form of living together? And something like Christian co-ops or spaces. So just in sort of like this analytical sense, I've often, in a variety, I dream about a lot of things, but something that,
Work together but don't live together?
yeah, who say like, we're gonna commit our life to an alternative form of labor.
is that considered a co-op? Is that
Probably, yeah. Yeah, and so, I don't know, that's just maybe an interesting space for the church to continue to think and dream about too.
Because then there are different spectrums of community, and so I intentionally focus on residential community, and that is my parameters. But then you get into things like co-ops, and that being like a way to think about community, and then dispersed community is another way to think about community. I really like
I
that.
don't see that as necessarily separate. I envision to have the worker cooperative incorporated in my committed community,
Exactly. Yes.
residential community. So that's the way we will generate income is from providing services or products through that worker cooperative.
Yeah, and it is variables like the work, the residential arrangement, where you are.
There's different ways to organize and categorize the authoritative book on intentional Christian community, the Intentional Christian Community Handbook, as 16 different ways that they slice that pie in how they organize different types of communities. I'm a math brain, and so the graphs are helpful. So they also have a few graphs on thick versus thin community, and then how they're also invested in the neighborhood. There's different ways to say organize, or don't want to rank, but kind of have an honest assessment of where different communities are at to maybe understand and contrast the differences between them.
Thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah, I like the 7 community types because the community I currently belong to would fall under the Young Adult Fellowship and is now England Church Hospitality. And I wonder if the reason you're not finding long-term what you get as Young Adult Fellowship is because they're not stable otherwise. Like you were talking about the 2 anchoring families, and we just had an issue because our 2 anchoring, you had an anchoring family, and we had 2 anchoring families try to come together and then actually break apart once the 2 anchoring families had issues. So now we're trying to redefine ourselves. This is actually super helpful because one of my other friends was always like, we aren't doing a lot of community now. And as an outsider, this is my first attempt at community, I'm like, we're doing a lot of community. And then I look at this and I'm like, no, we're the weakest form of community. Okay.
and then I don't Yeah, but then I don't think it's because like strong and weak has like positive and negative connotations, and I think it's fine to accept that different types of community suit different people at different stages of life, their different theologies, and so I think it's okay to be in a community of young adult fellowship, which is kind of community light, but it serves for a specific moment in time and forms people in a certain kind of way, which empowers them to move on in a different way, and that's okay and that's good.
Or perhaps maybe a lighter form of community is a long-term way of living.
Exactly, because then the more intensive ones, like the communities of hospitality, like that's only for a short period of time, and sometimes lightening up the communal commitment helps you last longer in a certain setting. And I think intentional Christian community is so context specific.
Brother, I hope you receive that word of grace, because I think that's grace to be heard around as you are transitioning to a new community. Like I found being with other intentional communities, there's like these standards that people judge themselves by, which become deeply unhelpful, deeply unhelpful, because then you begin to not be able to see what it is that the Spirit is attempting to incarnate in and with you, and what is in fact possible. Like, what is God's best move in this situation? It's sort of like as opposed to like, we heard these other people doing this thing and that sounds really cool. And it's like, I'm glad God's doing that for them. And like, what's God doing for us? Let's just...
Yeah, thanks. That's actually super helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going to end us on those wise words. And I will just say, if you want to learn more about the communities that I covered and more, this is my blog and podcast, which has like blogs and podcasts on each of the communities. And so if you're curious about models, this is hopefully a good place to go.
Thank you.